So this marks part 2 of the Platonic dialogue Cratylus. Now I live on a busy street, and I decided today to keep the window open. We'll see how that goes. So, as you could probably tell in the background, that noise is the cars passing the window. So last time looking back on it, we spent about an hour and a half getting through about 3 pages of this dialogue, Cratylus. And it is built rather quickly. A lot of the statements, a lot of the interests initially have been sort of profound, deep questions into the nature of things, into the fundamentals of things. And here in this dialogue, we are primarily concerned with the etymology of words. We are concerned about fundamental meaning in our language, where it comes from, why it is that we give names to certain things. And the discussion has evolved in a sort of an interesting manner, although it's only been 3 pages. We have gone from discussing the potential of the reasoning why we give names to things being some fundamental quality of the nature of the object that we assign a name to. We have also heard an argument of one that is of arbitrary nature, that is, we assign names to things, and the meaning behind the names that we assign things can change depending on what we give it. And so, of course, this gets into questions on both sides of the first proposals, in the sense of nature. What is it about nature? What fundamental quality of nature links up synchronously to our linguistic capabilities? On the other hand, how much of our arbitrary assignment of names to things is truly held by humanity as a whole? Because we have different languages, we have at times the same word that means 2 different things. We have variation between different cultures. We have variations within the same culture. And how do all of these things interact that we can actually maintain communication with one another and understand what we were talking about? Now, this applies as much at the material level, assigning names to different objects in the reality in front of us, as it does with the more sophisticated types of naming. The realm of the divine, we could say, in the heavens. And so if you haven't checked out the first episode, I recommend that. It'd be quite difficult to give a complete summary of what we've gone over for this episode. But briefly, we finished a discussion about the nature of an object in and of itself having its own essence and its own being. rather than being arbitrarily assigned an essence or a being by an intelligent mind. Now, it is the case that the mind does assign intelligibility, or it does find reality intelligible, and so there is a degree of that. But the objects in and of themselves have the quality, something of their own that allows them to be identified and separated from other things. Socrates says they are not in relation to us and are not made to fluctuate by how they appear to us. They are by themselves in relation to their own being or essence, which is theirs by nature. Then we got into the discussion of actions. And if things are of such a nature, doesn't the same hold of actions performed in relation to them? Or aren't actions included in some one class of things that are? So an action's performance accords with the action's own nature, and not with what we believe. Suppose, for example, that we were to undertake to cut something. If we make a cut in whatever we choose, and with whatever tool we choose, we will not succeed in cutting. But if in each case, we choose to cut in accord with the nature of cutting, and being cut, with the natural tool for cutting, we'll succeed and cut correctly. If we try to cut contrary to nature, however, we'll be in error and accomplish nothing. And so where we left off with is the following paragraph, the following statement by Socrates. Then will someone speak correctly if he speaks in whatever way he believes he should speak? Or isn't it rather the case that he will accomplish something and succeed in speaking if he says things in the natural way to say them? In the natural way for them to be said, and with the natural tool for saying them. But if he speaks in any other way, he will be in error and accomplish nothing. So we've gone from naming of the objects having their own essence and being, to the action that is related to that object, let's say, having its own essence and its own being, and then moving into speech, having its own essence and its own being. And I say that it has its own essence and its own being because when we say natural, that is sort of what we are implying. When Socrates says, he will accomplish something and succeed in speaking if he says things in the natural way to say them. And so the question is, okay, well, what is the natural way to say them? Which we have discussed a bit in the previous podcast. And so I will not linger here on what exactly we talked about, but I wish to continue. Hermogenes responds by saying, I believe so. Socrates says, tell me this, is there something you call speaking the truth, and something you call speaking falsehood? Indeed there is. Then some statements are true, while others are false. Certainly. And those that say of the things that they are true, while those that say of the things that they are not, are false. Hermogenes says yes. So it is possible to say both things that are and things that are not in a statement? Certainly. Is a whole true statement true, but not its parts? Hermogenes says no, the parts are also true. Socrates, are the large parts true, but not the small ones? Or are all of them true? In my view, they are all true, says Hermogenes. Is there a part of a statement that's smaller than a name? Hermogenes says no, it's the smallest part. So let's talk about that for a moment. Is there a part of a statement that is smaller than a name? First, I think we have to discuss what a statement is. We've discussed what a true statement is, and a true statement, to paraphrase Socrates, is sort of the report of the mind that matches the environment that mind lives within. There's an agreement between the object that sees and the object that is. And so a statement is necessarily a step back from that. And if we take a step back from that, we increase our probabilities. Because now, instead of just a true statement, we can have false statements. We can have any such statements. Now, just to use a sort of a book definition, we can say that a statement is a declarative sentence that expresses a fact or an opinion. That is a form of communication that conveys information or ideas from one person to another. A statement is usually structured as a subject-verb-object sentence, in which the subject is the entity being described, the verb indicates the action or state of being, and the object provides additional information about the subject. A statement is a proposition or a claim that can be either true or false. It can be used as the basis for logical reasoning and argumentation. Now, statements are different from questions, because statements tend to convey, to express opinions, to convey factual information. And so if we have a statement that includes, sort of linguistically, some subject, some object, and some action, we may not necessarily have to restrict it to that. But it is a fundamental structure of our language. Then the name that lies within that structure, the subject, object, action, the name that is given can be given to the subject, it can be given to the action, it can be given to the object. As we can see in this way how it is fundamental to our statements. Because we have to have some prior understanding, some prior knowledge of what the names of the things that we are describing and or doing are, in order to understand that spoken word, to understand if it's true or not. Hermogenes says, no, it is the smallest part. Socrates, in a true statement, is the smallest part something that's said? Hermogenes says yes. And, on your view, this part is then true. Hermogenes says yes. And then Socrates asks the question, and a part of a false statement is false? Hermogenes says that's right. So in a true statement, is the smallest part something that's said? So what might that mean? The smallest part. the name is something that is said. Now, if the name is to be true, it will be said. But certainly we can give a false name to something, can't we? And a part of a false statement is false. So isn't it possible to say a true or a false name, since true or false statements are possible? Hermogenes says certainly. Now, using names is a part of saying, since it is by using names that people say things. Hermogenes says certainly. And if speaking or saying is a sort of action, one that is about things, isn't using names also a sort of action? Hermogenes says yes. And didn't we see that actions aren't in relation to us, but have a special nature of their own? Hermogenes says we did. So if we are, to be consistent with what we said previously, we cannot name things as we choose. Rather, we must name them in the natural way for them to be named, and with the natural tool for naming them. And that way we'll accomplish something and succeed in naming. Otherwise, we won't. Hermogenes says, so it seems. So let's think about that distinction by Socrates. So if we are to be consistent with what we said previously, we cannot name things as we choose. Rather, we must name them in the natural way for them to be named, and with the natural tool for naming them. And that way we'll accomplish something and succeed in naming. Otherwise we won't. Okay, so this is quite the statement. So we know that this a statement, which is sort of a declaration, it's a factual claim. It has fundamental components to it, which we can call the name. A name can be something that is true or false. If a name is true, that means its essence and its being match up with the object. And that has to do with the meaning of the name. Now, speaking, we say, is an action. And this action is tethered to the name, because it is some object that the action is being performed upon. And now, just as the name, it has its essence and has its being, the action that is sort of willfully performed on the object also has its own essence and its own being. And in order for a successful action to take place, perhaps a successful intended action to take place, we have to properly understand the nature of the name and the nature of the action. And if the two natures agree, then we have a successful interaction. We have a true interaction. Now, it's a very complicated way to describe a very simple phenomenon, something that we experience in our everyday lives all day. But until we actually think about it, I think we can take it for granted. We can take it for granted so far that even, I would argue that the modern day, as difficult it seems as it is becoming, falsities are around every corner, and it becomes increasingly difficult to determine what is true and what is not true. A return to the fundamentals, I think, gives us a solid foundation for which we can brace ourselves against these falsities. So again, returning to what Socrates had to say, it's a similar statement to the one that we began with. We cannot name things as we choose. We've discussed this also in the previous episode. We cannot name things as we choose because there has to be some consistency. Part of the reason for this consistency is the relationship between individuals, and to maintain a adhered social collective, so we don't have a Tower Babel situation in which everybody's speech and language is confused and people are dispersed among the lands. Socrates says, again, what one has to cut, one must cut with something. Hermogenes says yes. And what one has to weave, one must weave with something. Certainly. And what one has to drill, one must drill with something. And what one has to name, one must name with something. Hermogenes says that's right. What must drilling be done with? A drill. Weaving, a shuttle. And naming, a name. So we see in this example then that the name is considered a tool. Well done. So, a name is also a sort of tool. That's right. And suppose I ask, what sort of tool is a shuttle? Isn't the answer one we weave with? Hermogenes says yes. What do we do when we weave? Don't we divide the warp and woof that are mixed together? Yes. Wouldn't you answer in the same way about drills and other tools? Certainly. And you'd also answer in the same way about names, since they are tools. What do we do when we name? Hermogenes says, I don't know the answer. Don't we instruct each other, that is to say, divide things according to their natures? Hermogenes says, certainly. So just as a shuttle is a tool for dividing warp and woof, a name is a tool for giving instruction, that is to say, for dividing being. Hermogenes says yes. Isn't a shuttle a weaver's tool? Hermogenes says of course. So a weaver will use shuttles well, and to use a shuttle well is to use it as a weaver does. By the same token, the instructor will use names well, and to use names well is to use it as an instructor does. Hermogenes says yes. When a weaver uses a shuttle well, whose product is he using? Hermogenes says a carpenter. Is everyone a carpenter, or only those who possess the craft of carpentry? Only those who possess the craft, he says. And whose product does a driller use well when he uses a drill? Hermogenes says a blacksmith's. And is everyone a blacksmith, or only those who possess the craft? Hermogenes says only those who possess the craft. Good. So whose product does an instructor use when he uses a name? Hermogenes says, I don't know. Can you at least tell me this? Who or what provides us with the names we use? I don't know that either. Don't you think that rules provide us with them? Hermogenes says, I suppose they do. So when an instructor uses a name, he's using the product of a rule setter. Hermogenes says, I believe he is. Do you think that every man is a rule setter, or only the one who possesses the craft? Hermogenes says, only the one who possesses the craft. It follows, then, that it isn't every man who can give names, Hermogenes, but only a name maker, and he, it seems, is a rule setter, the kind of craftsman most rarely found among human beings. Hermogenes says, I suppose so. So let's pause for a moment to reflect on that. Of all of the occupations mentioned, we have the individuals that design the tools, and we have the individuals that use the tools. Now each tool has its own purpose. And much like names, the tools, I think, are relegated to action, because we have to use the tools for some directed purpose. And as we mentioned before, this relationship between, I have no choice but to operate within the Cartesian frame for now, so we can work to bring it into a more efficient harmony. The Cartesian framework is the subject-object paradigm. Now, as we've discussed, the objects, they have their essence and they have their being. The actions have their essence and have their being in relationship to the object. And now certainly the tools. The tools must be used in a particular way to fit their design and to fit their purpose, to fit the essence and the being of the desired action. If we need to use a tool to drill something, we use a drill. To weave, we use a shuttle. To name something, we use names. Now, these makers of the tools, certainly you can have a sophisticated person that does both the action and the tool. Certainly the individual that is most proficient in their craft understands highly the sort of tool that they should use, and that can possibly extend into actually using or actually designing the tool to suit their needs for their own purposes. Just as the instructor who educates people in naming, if they are wise enough, proficient enough in their craft, they could become the tool maker, that is the rule setter for this language. And Socrates says that it seems the kind of craftsman most rarely found among human beings is the rule setter. Now, the rule setter has to be an interesting individual. They are, in the modern day, they are the scientists. In some sense, the language that we use is always bound to something. It is bound to a certain truth. It is bound to the being that is. And as we mentioned, the nature of something can be categorized by its various fundamental traits. And its fundamental traits, I think if they are excluded to a part of the whole, we run the risk of potentially naming things incorrectly or falsely. And so it's important that we have a judicious process by which we name things. Perhaps that not one individual is responsible for it, but many individuals. There's an idea out there of emergence, that there are problems with emergence perhaps, but we can say that as a natural process of finding, if it is left up to the various probabilities and the existing natures of what is or what are, it is possible that over time the human beings will devise language in such a way that accurately depicts the objects that we see before us and accurately depicts the various things that we use to interact with our environment. And so, although one individual may have a profound impact on the way that we see this, it is ultimately all of us that participate in this process. But of the individuals that are responsible for slicing up being, giving it names so that we can differentiate between different beings of objects that have different essences. How can we differentiate between a quarter and a penny without this distinction? Now, of course, we would understand the difference through vision, but language is an interesting thing because we can use it in the absence of vision. It is sort of an organ, a divine organ, I guess, if you will, that we've put in place to expand our mental horizon. We can expand our reach into reality beyond what is immediately in front of us. And so when I say quarter and I say penny, through the mechanism of this microphone, into my computer, up into the internet, with no visual input, with no tactile sensory inputs, all you need to know is quarter and penny, and it brings up an understanding of what the quarter and penny are. And perhaps you can go somewhere in your room and find a quarter and a penny and look at them and know exactly what I am saying. You can make the distinction between a couch and a quarter, a television and a floor. Socrates says, "Come now, consider where a rule setter looks in giving names. Use the previous discussion as your guide. Where does a carpenter look in making a shuttle? Isn't it to that sort of thing whose nature is to weave?" Hermogenes says, "Certainly." Suppose the shuttle breaks while he's making it. Will he make another looking to the broken one? Or will he look to the very form to which he looked in making the one he broke? Hermogenes says, "In my view, he will look to the form." Then it would be absolutely right to call what a shuttle itself is. Hermogenes says, "I suppose so." So let's pause here. Now, in the context of a shuttle, if we look at its form, the form of the shuttle, it has its being and its essence. The shuttle is a tool that separates the warp and woof. The tool that we use to produce clothing and other material. This tool has a specific purpose. Now, this specific purpose is fundamental to its being. For if we were to take the shuttle and to use it for a different purpose, if it is to be effective for another purpose, it would be unintentional. But it is likely that if the form of the shuttle is true, then it would be specific to the use that it was intended for. And in the case of the shuttle, it's quite specific. It's not that of a bucket, because a bucket has many different functions. It can carry many different things. A shuttle is much more specific. So in terms of the scale of purposeful actions, I think a tool can vary. But to reflect on what Socrates said about the form of the tool, now I think that there are many various ways that a physical representation of the form can manifest itself. But we shouldn't confuse the form of the shuttle for its physical representation. Because, like I said, there could be many. There could be many, but they all operate within that framework, that boundary of the purpose that it is intended for. For if we create a shuttle that breaks, we have to go back to the form. Because the shuttle is not intended to break. It is intended to weave. It is intended for the weaver to use. We have two different types of shuttles, perhaps for slightly different purposes, but again, they operate within that same realm for that purpose. Hence, whenever he has to make a shuttle for weaving garments, or any sort, whether light or heavy, linen or woolen, mustn't it possess the form of a shuttle, and mustn't he put into it the nature that naturally best suits it to perform its own work? Hermogenes says yes. And the same holds of all other tools. When a craftsman discovers the type of tool that is naturally suited for a given type of work, he must embody it in the material out of which he is making the tool. He mustn't make the tool in whatever way he happens to choose, but in the natural way, so it seems that a blacksmith must know how to embody in iron the type of drill naturally suited for each type of work. Hermogenes says certainly. And a carpenter must embody in wood the type of shuttle naturally suited for each type of weaving. Hermogenes says that is right. Socrates, because it seems that there's a type of shuttle that's naturally suited to each type of weaving, and the same holds of all tools in general. And so this is what we just discussed. Hermogenes says yes. Socrates, so mustn't a rule setter also know how to embody in sounds and syllables the name naturally suited to each thing? And if he is to be an authentic giver of names, mustn't he, in making and giving each name? And if different rule setters do not make each name out of the same syllables, we mustn't forget that different blacksmiths, who are making the same tool for the same type of work, don't all make it out of the same iron. But as long as they give it the same form, even if that form is embodied in a different iron, the tool will be correct, whether it is made in Greece or abroad. Isn't that so? Hermogenes says, certainly. Don't you evaluate Greek and foreign rule setters in the same way, provided they give each thing the form of name suited to it, no matter what syllables it is embodied in? They are equally good rule setters, whether they are in Greece or abroad. Hermogenes says, certainly. Now, who is likely to know whether the appropriate form of shuttle is present in any given bit of wood? A carpenter who makes it, or a weaver who uses it? Hermogenes says, in all likelihood, Socrates, it is the one who uses it. So, who uses what a lyre maker produces? Isn't he the one who would know best how to supervise the manufacture of lyres, and who would also know whether what has been made well or not? Hermogenes says, certainly. Socrates, who is that? Hermogenes, a lyre player. And who will supervise a shipbuilder? A ship's captain. And who can best supervise the work of a rule setter, whether here or abroad, a judge, and judge his products? Isn't it whoever will use them? Hermogenes says, yes. And isn't that the person who knows how to ask questions? Hermogenes says, certainly. And he also knows how to answer them. Yes. And what would you call someone who knows how to ask and answer questions? Wouldn't you call him a dialectician? Hermogenes says, yes, I would. So it's the work of a carpenter to make a rudder, and if the rudder is to be a fine one, a ship captain must supervise him. Hermogenes says, evidently. But it's the work of a rule setter, it seems, to make a name. And if names are to be given well, a dialectician must supervise him. That's right. It follows that the giving of names can't be as inconsequential a matter as you think, Hermogenes, nor can it be the work of an inconsequential or chance person. So Cratylus is right in saying that things have natural names, and that not everyone is a craftsman of names, but only someone who looks to the natural name of each thing and is able to put its form into letters and syllables. Hermogenes. I don't know how to oppose you, Socrates. It isn't easy for me suddenly to change my opinion. I think you would be more likely to persuade me if you showed me just what this natural correctness of names you're talking about consists in. Socrates says, my dear Hermogenes, I don't have a position on this. You have forgotten what I told you a while ago, namely that I don't know about names, but that I would investigate them with you. And now that we are investigating them, you and I, at least this much is clearer than before, that names do possess some sort of natural correctness, and that it isn't every man who knows how to name things well. Isn't that right? Hermogenes agrees. So our next task is to try to discover what this correctness is, if indeed you want to know. Of course I do. Then investigate the matter. How am I to do that? Says Hermogenes. The most correct way is together with people who already know, but you must pay them well and show gratitude besides. These are the sophists. Your brother Cratylus got his reputation for wisdom from them in return for a lot of money. So you had better beg and implore him to teach you what he learned from Protagoras about the correctness of names, since you haven't yet come into any money of your own. But it would be absurd for me to beg for Protagoras and his truth, Socrates, as if I desired the things contained in it and thought them worthwhile, when I totally reject them. Socrates. Well, if that doesn't suit you, you'll have to learn from Homer and the other poets. And where does Homer say anything about names, Socrates? And what does he say? Socrates says in lots of places. The best and most important are the ones in which he distinguishes between the names humans call things and those the gods call them. Or don't you think that these passages tell us something remarkable about the correctness of names? Surely the gods call things by their naturally correct names, or don't you think so? Hermogenes says, I certainly know that if they call them by any names at all, it's by the correct ones. But what passages are you referring to? Socrates says, do you know where he says that the Trojan river that had single compact with Hephaestus, called Xanthos by the gods and Scamandros by men? I certainly do. And don't you think that it's an awe-inspiring thing to know that the river is more correctly called Xanthos than Scamandros? Or consider, if you like, when he says about a certain bird that the gods call it Chalcus, but men call it Cymindis. Do you think it's an inconsequential matter to learn that it is far more correct to call this bird Chalcus than to call it Cymindis or Cymindis? What about all similar things that Homer and other poets tell us? For example, that it is more correct to call a certain hill Merin than Batia. But perhaps these examples are too hard for you and me to figure out. It is easier and more within human power, I think, to investigate the kind of correctness Homer ascribes to Scamandrios and Astyanax, which he says are the names of Hector's sons. You know, of course, the lines to which I refer. Certainly. Which of the names given to the boy do you suppose Homer thought was more correct? Astyanax or Scamandrios? Hermogenes says I really can't say. Look at it this way. If you were asked who gives names more correctly, those who are wiser or those who are more foolish, what would you answer? That is clearly those who are wiser. And which class do you think is wiser on the whole, a city's women or its men? Hermogenes says it's men. Now you know, don't you, that Homer tells us that Hector's son was called Astyanax by the men of Troy. But if the men called him Astyanax, isn't it clear that Scamandrios must be what the women called him? Hermogenes says probably so. And didn't Homer also think that the Trojans were wiser than their women? I suppose he did. So mustn't he have thought that Astyanax was a more correct name for the boy than Scamandrios? Evidently. Well, let's investigate why it is more correct. Doesn't Homer himself suggest a very good explanation when he says he alone defended their city and long walls? For because of this, you see, it seems correct to call the son of the defender Astyanax, or lord of the city, as to Anax, which, as Homer says, his father was defending. Hermogenes says, that seems right to me. So I think it's worth for a moment discussing the two names and their meanings. The first, Scamandrios, derived from Greek mythology, means son of the river Scamander. Scamander was a river god who fought against the Greek hero Achilles during the Trojan War. Scamandrios was the son of the river god, and his name changes to Astyanax, which means king of the city or lord of the city. Now perhaps what the women call him, Scamandrios, would be more akin to the time around his birth. And the second name of this person, Astyanax, would be after the deeds in life, this defender of the city. It has to do, and it has to be in relation to the actions that he performed. And because of that, now he takes on this new meaning. His name takes on this new meaning. And it's an interesting conception of the naming of people, because, we don't see that today. Nor would I imagine that this is something that would be commonplace among the Greeks at the time, although it's possible. But just for the sake of thought experiment, if it was indeed the case that after one performed a defining deed in life, and shortly after they were given their birth name, after perhaps their family lineage or what have you, it would be an interesting change in the name as the life progressed, because the change in name would reflect the accomplishments or the experiences of the individual. And it would make it more meaningful. And that's not to say that there are no names for which the names have no meaning. I think that there are plenty. But certainly, in the United States, if one is to go around and to ask an individual what their name means, I doubt that very many people would be able to tell them what their name means or why they have a given name. And if they can tell one why they have a given name, it may very well be for superficial purposes. And so Hermogenes says in response to this, "That seems right to me." And Socrates says, "It does? You understand it, Hermogenes? For I don't understand it yet myself." Hermogenes then second-guesses himself, and he says, "Then I certainly don't. But my good friend, didn't Homer also give Hector his name?" Hermogenes says, "What if he did?" Well, it seems to me that Hector is more or less as the same as Astyanax, since both names seem to be Greek. After all, Lord, Annex, and Possessor, Hector, signify pretty much the same, since both are names for a king. Surely, a man possesses that of which he is lord, since it is clear that he controls, owns, and has it. But perhaps you think I'm talking nonsense, and that I'm wrong to suppose that I've found a clue to Homer's beliefs about the correctness of names. Hermogenes says, "No, I don't think you're wrong. You may well have found a clue. At any rate, it seems to me that it is right to call a lion's offspring a lion, and a horse's offspring a horse. I'm not talking about some monster other than a horse that happens to be born from a horse, but one that is a natural offspring of its kind. If, contrary to nature, a horse gave birth to a calf, it should be called a calf, not a colt. And if something isn't a human offspring, is born to a human, I don't think it should be called a human. And the same applies to trees and all the rest. Don't you agree?" "I agree." "Good. But you had better watch out, in case I trick you. For by the same argument my offspring of a king should be called a king. But it doesn't matter whether the same thing is signified by the same syllables or by different ones. If a letter is added or subtracted, that doesn't matter either, so long as the being or essence of the thing is in control and is expressed in its name." So what points do we have so far? Now initially when Socrates is talking about Hector, he's talking about the name that's fit for the lord, for being a lord, or a king, or a ruler. This is similar to the reasoning and the logic that we had just expressed. That the name and its meaning has some relationship to the person's achievements or their position in life. Socrates goes on to make the comparison between animals bringing into being their offspring and their names being fairly consistent with those offspring because they are of a like kind. It serves as an identifier. But if it was the case that an offspring was not the same in kind as the one that brought it into being, then it would still be named for the thing that it is. It wouldn't be named for the thing that brought it into existence, because its nature is fundamentally different. And Socrates goes on to say, "Watch out in case I trick you. By the same argument, any offspring of a king should be called a king, but it doesn't matter whether the same thing is signified by the same syllables or by different ones. And if a letter is added or subtracted, that doesn't matter either. So as long as the being or essence of the thing is in control and is expressed in its name." So as long as we have an understanding of the being or essence of a thing in its name, the name could change a bit. There is fluidity to language. And Hermogenes says, "How do you mean?" It's something fairly simple. You know that when we speak of the elements or letters of the alphabet, it is their names we utter, not the letters themselves, except in the case of these four, E, U, O, and epsilon. And I took a little pause there to read the footnote. The name epsilon, upsilon, omicron, and omega were not used in Plato's time, only simply pronounced the sound. We make names for all the other vowels and consonants, as you know, by uttering additional letters together with them. But as long as we include the force or power of the letter, we may correctly call it by that name, and it will express it for us. Take the beta, for example. The addition of the E with a line over it, not sure what that is pronounced as, the T and A, does no harm and doesn't prevent the whole name from expressing the nature of that element or letter which the rule setter wished to name. So well did he know how to give names to the letters. Alright, so that's a bit more complicated. Now what exactly is Socrates saying here? So this is a difficult one. I'm not quite sure I completely follow what Socrates is saying here. So in some sense we have the indication that if a letter is added or subtracted, it doesn't matter as long as the being or essence of that word remains consistent with the name, I guess we can say. And he gives this example of beta, B-E-T-A. He says the addition of ETA does not harm and does not prevent the whole name from expressing the nature of that element or letter which the rule setter wished to name. And so fundamentally I think this is a problem of retention, of retaining some fundamental identity. And in the addition or in subtraction of different letters for particular words, as long as the identity is maintained in a word or a name, then it holds the meaning that the rule setter wished to place, or wished to have for that sound, that series of letters. Socrates says, doesn't the same argument apply to king? For a king will probably be the son of a king, a good man, the son of a good man, a fine man, the son of a fine one, and so on. So unless a monster is born, the offspring of a kind will be of the same kind, and should be called by the same name. But because of variation in their syllables, names that are really the same seem different to the uninitiated. And so just as in music, we'll take blues for an example, you end your expressions on a root, is sort of your home base. And that home base is the key that you're playing in. That's where you live. That's sort of that's your nature in a certain sense. That is your sound. And I think just in this way, there's a root to the names. There's a root to the name that describes what a king is. Now, the additional symbols that are placed on after that perhaps are meant to denote different qualities of that person, perhaps. Different things to identify it from a previous king. But fundamentally, the core symbol, the core syllable, remains that which is closely related to the nature of the thing that's named. So in this example, it would be the king. And we can think of the syllable as a building block, the basic sounds of words. And so if we continue to add building blocks to the whole, then it just becomes the whole. The whole is sort of enriched by these differing syllables. If it were the case that if a new syllable came about, which Socrates has mentioned, but I'll mention it again, that disrupted or negated the initial root, let's say, then the name would cease to be. Now there is a further problem, though, that even though the root exists, the addition or variation of symbols can confuse those who don't necessarily understand the extra or added syllables. He says, similarly, a doctor's medicines, which have different colors and perfumes added to them, appear different to us, although they are really the same and appear the same to a doctor, who looks only to their power to cure and isn't disconcerted by the additives. And so again, there is some fundamental nature about these things. Perhaps the additives are good for distinction, but the additives don't mean anything to its fundamental core. If you remove the additive and it remained like a white color, let's say, the fundamental effect of that that medicine will be the same. The additive has no true effect on the fundamental nature of the object. Similarly, someone who knows about names looks to their force or power and isn't disconcerted if a letter is added, transposed, or subtracted, or even if the force a name possesses is embodied in different letters altogether. So there has to be, in my mind, a consistent force that is attributed to that object by its nature in order for it to remain consistent in order for somebody to not become confused. So, for example, in the names Hector and Astyanax, which we were discussing just now, one of the letters is the same, except T, but they signify the same anyway. And what letters does Archipolus, ruler of a city, have in common with them? And yet, it expresses the same thing. Many other names signify simply king. Others signify general, for example, Aegis, leader, Polemarchus, warlord, Eupolemus, famous healer, and Asembrotus, healer of mortals. And we might perhaps find many others, which differ in their letters and syllables, but which have the same force or power when spoken. Is that plain to you or not? And Hermogenes replies, certainly. Part of the problem here is identifying exactly at what level this force or power exists. Because of the words mentioned here, we have leader, warlord, famous healer, healer of mortals, ruler of a city. They differ in letters and symbols, and syllables, I should say. But they have the same force or power when spoken. And so I don't think he's saying that these names have the same force or power. I think he's saying that if they are changed in such a way to mean the same thing, but still mean the same thing, then they are the same thing. Just as Hector and Astyanax are pretty much the same name, because they mean similar things. Socrates says, then those that are born according to nature should be given the same names as their fathers. And Hermogenes says yes. What about the ones that were born contrary to nature? Those that are some form of monster. For instance, when a god and pious man has an impious son, the latter shouldn't have his father's name, but that of the kind of which he belongs, just as in our earlier example of a horse having a calf as an offspring. And Hermogenes says yes. Therefore, the impious son of a pious father should be given the name of the kind to which he belongs. Hermogenes says that's right. Then he shouldn't be called Theophilus, or God-beloved, or Mnestheus, mindful of God, or anything of that sort, but something that signifies the opposite, if indeed names are to be actually correct. Hermogenes says that's absolutely right, Socrates. Socrates says, thus the name Orestes, mountain man, is surely correct. Hermogenes, whether it was given to him by chance or by some poet who displayed in his name the brutality, savagery, and ruggedness of his nature. Hermogenes says, it seems so, Socrates. And his father's name also seems to accord with nature. It does. Yes, for Agamemnon is someone who worked hard and persevered, bringing his plans to completion because of his virtue or excellence. The stay of his army in Troy and his perseverance there is a sign of this. And thus the name Agamemnon signifies that this man is admirable, Agastos, for holding his ground, Epimon. The name Atreus also seems to be correct, for both his murderer of Chrysippus and his cruelty to Thyestes were damaging and destructive to his virtue, or Atreia, damaging and destructive. However, the meaning of his name is somewhat distorted and obscure, so that it doesn't express his nature to everyone, but to those who understand about names, it adequately expresses what Atreus means. For whether the name accords with his stubbornness, Aterius, or his boldness, Atrestos, or his destructiveness, Atreus, it is correctly given to him. I think Pelops also has a fitting name, for Pelops signifies he who sees only what is near at hand. Pelos, opsis. Hermogenes says, how is that? Because according to the legend, he didn't think about or foresee what the long-term consequence of murdering Cratylus would be for his entire family, or all the misery that would overwhelm them. In his eagerness to win the hippodamia by any means available, he saw only what was ready to hand. He saw only what was ready to hand and on the spot, that is to say, what was nearby Pelos. Everyone would agree, too, that Tantalus was given correctly, and according to nature, if that's what is said about its bearer is true. Hermogenes says, what's that? They say that many terrible misfortunes happened to him in his life, and the last of which was the total overthrow of his country, and that in Hades, after his death, he had a stone suspended, Talantia, over his head, in wondrous harmony with his name. It's exactly as if someone had wished to name him Talantatos, most waited upon, but had disguised the name and said Tantalus instead. In some such way, in any case, the chance of legend supplied him with his name. His father, who is said to have been Zeus, also seems to have had an altogether fine name given to him, but it isn't easy to figure out. That's because the name Zeus is exactly like the phrase that we divide into two parts, Xena and Dia, some of us using one of them and some the other. But these two names reunited into one express the nature of the god, which is just what we said a name should do. Certainly, no one is more the cause of life, Zen, whether for us or for anything else, than the ruler and a king of all things. Thus, Xena and Dia together correctly name the god that is always the cause of life, Di Han Zen, for all creatures. But as I say, his name, which is really one, is divided in two, Dia and Xena. When one hears that Zeus is the son of Kronos, one might find that offensive at first, and it might seem more reasonable to say that he is the offspring of a great intellect. But in fact, Kronos' name signifies not a child, Koros, but the purity and clarity of his intellect or understanding. According to legend, he was the son of Uranus, heaven, whose name is also correctly given, for the sight of what is above is well called by the name Urania, or heavenly. Looking at the things above, Horosa ta ano, and astronomers say, Hermogenes, that results in purity of intellect. If I could remember Hesiod's genealogy, and the even earlier ancestors of the gods he mentions, I wouldn't have stopped explaining the correctness of the names he gives them until I had tested this wisdom which has suddenly come upon me. I do not know from where, to see whether or not it holds up till the end. Hermogenes says, indeed, Socrates, you do seem to me to be exactly like a prophet who has suddenly been inspired to deliver oracles. So what can we say of this paragraph here? Now, at the base level, Socrates is making the argument that indeed what the name that is given to a particular thing is in relation to its nature. And he gives concrete cultural examples of the gods and why they are named as they are. So he gives the example of Zeus. And he says that there are two phrases that are commonly used in the context of Zeus: dia and zen or zena. Now, dia means passing through or godly. Zen means to be alive or to live. And Socrates also says that the name is fitting because he says, thus Zena and Dia together correctly name the god that is always the cause of life, Dihanzen, for all creatures. And so we have this expression that is attributed to the name of Zeus. And we could think of Zeus as the divine life. The divine life that provides life for all living things. Now Cronus, the father of Zeus, Cronus is the purity of understanding. Now this purity of understanding, if something is to be pure, it's without blemish, it is free of insult, it is beautiful in a sense, and its liberation from all of the lesser things makes it pure. And so that understanding, which is free of all of the superficial blemishes, is the truth in and of itself. Because many of us understand certain things to be true, but we also understand that there are layers, that there are levels to truth. We can understand that in a certain respect, that when we say that we are tired, we have the sort of embodied understanding of what it means to be tired, and yet most of us don't understand the biophysiology behind tiredness and exhaustion. Nor does the biophysiology completely encapsulate what it means to be tired. But this Kronos, this purity of understanding, encapsulates all these aspects of knowing the truth. And of the ones that we've mentioned so far, we have the embodiment, we have the, I'll say embodiment or personal experience of, we have the material understanding of the phenomena. We can also understand the perspective of that tiredness in relation to other forms of tiredness. And so these are a few things that I'm using as an example to hammer in the point that our understanding, although we may be convinced quite often, and we sort of have to be convinced of certain things to be true. For if we were to delude ourselves into thinking that we are a god like Cronus, that we have this purity of understanding, then it would be very hard to function in life, because there are certain things that we just sort of take at either at face value or based on partial evidence. Or maybe I should say a partial way of understanding and knowing. We don't wait for all the pieces to come into alignment in order to act. Now, this is not an excuse for people not to live up to their fullest potential, and to live up to the highest truth that's possible. But back to the main point here. The name that applies to the nature of the object. Cronus, purity of understanding. And then Uranus, which is heaven, the things above. And so if we are to look chronologically, and one thing I will mention, that it's interesting that Socrates mentions Helios's genealogy of the gods, to trace it all the way back. As if he traced the genealogy all the way back, he would find more and more fundamental things. Whereas Zeus is the divine life, Cronus, purity of understanding, Uranus, heaven. It seems, to me at least, that this is a pattern of ascension, back in time, through the fathers. And Socrates implies that if he was going to go back far enough into this genealogy, he would have continued his explanation of names and their meaning and how it applies to the nature of that object. So Margines says, "Indeed, Socrates, you do seem to me to be exactly like a prophet who has suddenly been inspired to deliver oracles." Socrates says, "Yes, Hermogenes, and I, for my part, mostly blame Euthyphro of the deme of Prospalta for its coming upon me. I was with him at the dawn, lending an ear to his lengthy discussion. He must have been inspired, because it looks as though he has not only filled my ears with his superhuman wisdom, but taken possession of my soul as well. So it seems to me that this is what we ought to do. Today, we'll use this wisdom and finish our examination of names, but tomorrow, if the rest of you agree, we'll exercise it and purify ourselves as soon as we found someone, whether priest or wise man, who is clever at that kind of purification." Hermogenes says, "That's fine with me. I'd be very glad to hear what remains to be said about names." "Then that's what we must do. Since we now have some sort of outline to follow, which names do you want us to begin with, in order to find out whether names themselves will testify to us that they are not given by chance, but have some sort of correctness? The names that heroes and men are said to have might perhaps deceive us. After all, as we saw at the beginning, they are often given because they are the names of ancestors, and some of them are wholly inappropriate. Many, too, are given in the hope that they will prove appropriate, such as Eutychides, son of good fortune, Sosius, Savior, Theophilus, God-beloved, and many others. In my view, we must leave such names aside. We are most likely to find correctly given names among those concerned with the things that by nature always are, since it is proper for their names to be given with the greatest care, and some may even be the work of a more than human power." Hermogenes says, "I think that's sensible, Socrates." So what Socrates says here is interesting. because he's making the omission or the recognition that a name, it is possible that it can be a sort of it can be inappropriately designated to an individual or to an object. And so in some sense that provides an interesting food for thought. For if a name is just if it can be, some arbitrary representation for the thing or the individual, and if it's also possible that if something is to be named correctly, then it must represent the nature of the thing of concern, of the object of concern, then there is great possibility, I would say, for confusion in terms of language and in terms of naming. And now this is something that we have discussed before about the boundaries and about the center around which our social collective operates, around which the center around which we bind ourselves. We bind ourselves to a center of intelligibility. It is some frame of reference. This frame of reference can be changed, it can be modified through the ages, but if a society is to exist, if a social collective is to exist at all, they must recognize something about their reality and have this commonality spread among them so that they can share in their being, I guess you can say, in their understanding. Now what's interesting to me is that Socrates also makes another observation. He says, after all, as we saw at the beginning, they are often given because they are the names of ancestors, and some of them are wholly inappropriate. Many, too, are given in the hope that they will prove appropriate. Right, so this is the sense of the arbitrariness, that somebody is given a name that means something. Now there's a level of arbitrariness, right, because we can give a name to a child and know nothing about the child. The child hasn't grown. We don't know their personality characteristics. We can name the child for an event. We can name the child before it's born. But as we can see, the less we know, sort of the more arbitrary the name is that we give to something. And Socrates, I think he points that out there when he says, many too are given in the hope that they will prove appropriate, but many are wholly inadequate. And I think that there are other names, sort of going back a few paragraphs to the discussion about the gods and their names, that the names of the gods are found rather than given, because we discover their action by observation of our environment, and about the power and the sway that these divine entities hold over our minds and our social consciousness. We discover them in the darkness of our understanding as sort of a light to see. These divine beings then serve as an illumination for us into a deeper understanding. For, as we saw in the very nature of some of their names, purity of understanding, divine life, heaven, these are all very lofty names for very lofty beings. Then there is the other aspect of this arbitrary nature, where somebody could be named a name, just to be given something to be called by. The name might not even be known, or the meaning, I should say, of the name might not even be known by the person that is applying or giving the name. And so in some sense, the person grows into the name, and whatever meaning that name had held prior is diminished by the person that grows into that name. And so in some sense, we have the pre-existence of a name that is found by man as he discovers more about his reality. And then there is the growing into name that is more on the level of the individual. But in this sense, it's not really true. It's a sort of an affordance. It's sort of something that we say, okay, we accept out of laziness. Because there's no true meaning in the name. There's true meaning in the value and the worth of the individual. But for those who are truly named without purpose or cause or understanding of the meaning of the name, then this is necessarily the case. And I think that this case is an unfortunate one, and that when we choose to name individuals or objects, my mind frequently goes to naming of children, that we should be judicious, we should be reasoned in our approach to naming. We should have good reason to do so. And while it may not be necessarily in line with the nature of the individual to be, it should be in line with some fundamental principle that the parents share, that they would like to instill and leave to their child. And so in this sense, the name will be perfected as the child grows and the parents bestow their influence on the child. They teach that child right and wrong, they teach them ethical standards and so forth. So isn't it right to begin by seeing why the name Theoi, or gods, is itself one that the gods are correctly called? Hermogenes says it probably is. Socrates: I suspect something like this. It seems to me that the first inhabitants of Greece believed only in those gods in which many foreigners still believe today: the sun, moon, earth, stars, and sky. And, seeing that these were always moving or running, they gave them the name Theoi, because it was in their nature to run, Theon. Later, when they learned about the other gods, they called them all by the same name. Does that seem likely, or am I talking nonsense? Hermogenes says it's very likely. What shall we investigate next? Clearly, it's daemons, then heroes, then humans, isn't it? Now, daemons are gods or children of the gods, or messengers from the gods. Hermogenes says, yes, daemons are next. And what is the correct meaning of the name daemons, Hermogenes? See if you think there is anything in what I am about to say. Hermogenes says, say it, and I will. Do you know what Hesiod says daemons are? Daemons. No, I don't remember, Hermogenes says. Do you remember that he speaks of a golden race, which was the first race of human beings to be born? Hermogenes says, yes, I remember that. He says this about it: since this race has been eclipsed by fate, they are all called sacred daemons. They live on earth and are good, warding off evil and guarding mortal men. Hermogenes says, so what? Well, I don't think he's saying that the golden race is by nature made of gold. but that it is good and fine. I consider it a proof of this that he calls us a race of iron. Diogenes says that's true. So don't you think that if someone who presently exists were good, Hesiod would say that he too belonged to the golden race? Diogenes said he probably would. Are good people any different from wise ones? Diogenes says, no, they are not. It is principally because daemons are wise and knowing, I think, that Hesiod says they are named daemons. In our older Attic dialect, we actually find the word daemon, daemonis. So Hesiod and many other poets speak well when they say that when a good man dies, he has a great destiny and a great honor and becomes a daemon, which is a name given to him because it accords with wisdom. And I myself assert, indeed, that every good man, whether alive or dead, is daemonic, and is correctly called daemon. Diogenes says, and I think that I completely agree with you, Socrates, but what about the name hero? What is it? Socrates, that one isn't so hard to understand because the name has been a little altered. It expresses the fact that heroes were born out of love, or eros. How do you mean? Don't you know that the heroes are demigods? Diogenes says, so what? So all of them sprang from the love of a god for a mortal woman, or of a mortal man for a goddess. And if, as before, you investigate the matter by relying on old Attic, you will get a better understanding, since it will show you that the name hero is only a slightly altered form of the word love, or eros. The very thing from which the heroes sprang. And either this is the reason they are called heroes, or else because they were sophists, clever speech-makers, and dialecticians, skilled questioners. For erain is the same as lagain, to speak. And therefore, as we were saying just now, in the Attic dialect, the heroes turn out to be speech-makers and questioners. Hence the noble breed of heroes turns out to be a race of speech-makers and sophists. That isn't hard to understand. But can you tell me why members of the human race are called humans, or anthropoi? That's much harder to understand. Diogenes says, how could I do that, Socrates? I wouldn't strain myself to find it, even if I could, because I think you're much more likely to find it than I am. Socrates, you really have faith in Euthyphro's inspiration, it seems. Diogenes says clearly. And you're certainly right to have faith in it. Indeed, I seem to have had such a clever insight just now that if I'm not careful, I'll be in danger of becoming altogether too wise before the day is out. So pay attention. First of all, we must bear in mind the following point about names. We often add letters or take them out and change the accents as well, thus swerving aside from what we want to name. For instance, take D. Philos, friend to Zeus. In order for us to have a name instead of a phrase, we took out the second I and pronounced the second syllable with a grave accent instead of an acute diphilos. In other cases, we do the opposite, inserting letters and pronouncing a syllable with an acute accent instead of a grave. Okay, so let's back up for a moment. If we recall the discussion of the daemons, it's important to understand that this daemon is separate from demon. There is really no relationship. Now that is evident by the fact that these daemons, as I said, are gods or children of the gods. or messengers from the gods. And so these people, this golden race, is sort of a rung lower in the hierarchy of beings. And within the golden race, we see the characteristics of the good and the wise. And the good and the wise among this generation are given the name daemons. And moreover from that, those that, while in life or after death, as in the case of when Hesiod or Hesiod, I should say, and many other poets speak well when they say that when a good man dies, he had a great destiny, and a great honor, and becomes a daemon. He's honored by that name, because he, in his life, was a man of wisdom and goodness. Then Hermogenes brings up the idea of the hero, or the name of the hero. Socrates says that this name hero hasn't been changed much from its original form. I think that in and of itself is an interesting thing to say, implying that language over time can change from its original, its intended purpose or intended meaning. And he says, it expresses the fact that heroes were born out of love, or eros. Another interesting conception. Now, there are some who have adopted the term eros to mean purely sexual desire or attraction, and placed in the context of a romantic relationship. But according to Plato, there's a more refined definition to this. The concept of eros, according to Plato, is a force that drives individuals towards beauty and truth and the divine. And the eros is not limited to physical desire, and it can be something that can be experienced as a desire for knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. So the hero, the individual that saves, the individual that does the right thing when called upon, does so because of their desire for knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. It's their drive that they have towards beauty, truth, and the divine. Now, these heroes, Socrates says, are considered to be demigods, which are the mixture, sort of the half and half between the human form and the divine form. They're not fully human, but they're not fully gods. They are said to possess these powers or abilities that are beyond normal human scope and scale, perhaps. These are exceptional individuals. And so Socrates says, so all of them sprang from love of a god for a mortal woman, or of a mortal man for a goddess. And as if, as before, you investigate the matter by relying on the old Attic, you will get a better understanding, since it will show you that the name hero is only a slightly altered form of the word love, or eros, the very thing from which the hero sprang. And so it's interesting, we see this relationship between the name of the hero and the thing that it sprang forth from. Similar to the discussion that we had about Zeus and his father and the father before him. And each line up the chain or back up towards the source of this divine lineage, you have more and more fundamental, let's say, characteristics of the name that is attributed to the god. And either this is the reason they were called heroes, or else because they were sophists. Now we have to remind ourselves what the sophists, or who the sophists were. Now the sophists, as Socrates said, are speech makers, rhetoricians, dialecticians, skilled questioners, or erotan, for Irain, or Irin. He says is the same as legain, or to speak. And these sophists were known to argue any point. They thought that truth and morality were relative and subjective, that there was no absolute standard for right and wrong. This often spurred criticism against their ways, because they were not beholden to any particular point. They argued many sides of the case. They had an important role that they played in Greek philosophy in the 5th century BC. They influenced Plato and Aristotle. Plato, Socrates were not considered sophists, although skilled dialecticians they would probably consider themselves. Because I think what we can say of Socrates and of Plato is that they were very concerned about finding the truth. Now, they would argue many points, but ultimately they were after the truth. They believed that it could be achieved. And so why would he say then, and either this is the reason they were called heroes, that is, sprang from love, or else because they were sophists, clever speech makers. Now, partly he would say this, I imagine, because of the similarity between the words and the roots to that of the hero in relation to the sophists and the speech makers. And he says if this is the case, the heroes turn out to be speech makers and questioners. Hence the noble breed of heroes turns out to be a race of speech makers and sophists. Now, I suppose we could draw conclusions about this. If this was indeed the case, perhaps it was not as an elevated distinction to be called the name of hero. But this is neither here nor there. We are still primarily discussing the origin of where the names come from. We have yet to arrive on a real concrete example. Now we have, overall, I could say, of the recent discussion that we've been having, Socrates' exploration into the naming of things for their nature. We do have a general direction that does seem to point to a linking between the names that we currently are aware of and some earlier source of that name. And in some cases, it is the case that these names they come from a purer source. And the names that we now come to know represent that source. Again, the example of Zeus and his forefathers, or the example of hero, springing from love. So then we move into the discussion of why human beings are named as they are, why they are called humans, or anthropoi. And Socrates goes into an explanation that can seem rather confusing at first. He says, first of all, we must bear in mind the following point about names. We often add letters to, or take them out, and change the accents as well, thus swerving aside from what we want to name. For instance, take D. Philos, friend to Zeus. In order for us to have a name instead of a phrase, we took out the second I and pronounced the second syllable with a grave accent instead of an acute diphilos. In other cases, we do the opposite, inserting letters and pronouncing a syllable with an acute accent instead of a grave. And so it's important to understand that when he says acute accent, this is sort of the apostrophe that is pointing to the left. It's used to indicate stress on the syllable of a word, while a grave accent, this is the apostrophe that is pointing to the right, is used to indicate that the syllable is unstressed. The acute accent is written above the vowel, and the grave accent is written above the vowel, but tilted to the left. And when it says tilted to the left, it's probably using the reference point as the inferior base of the accent, because then it would tilt to the left. But if you use the superior pole of the apostrophe, then it tilts to the right. So we have something that could either be removed or added, which changes the structure of the word. It can change it into a phrase as an extended meaning, or it can compact it into a name, which can refer to an object. Now this phrase, friend to Zeus, has a relational aspect to it, whereas the name is more specific to the object or the individual. He says in other cases we do the opposite, inserting letters and pronouncing a syllable with an acute accent instead of a grave. And now pronunciation, too, goes into the refinement of our language, because it's not purely the way the letters are arranged, but it is in the way that they are pronounced phonetically that can attribute to its meaning. Hermogenes says that's true. Now I think, says Socrates, our name for human beings is a case of just this sort. It was a phrase but became a name. One letter, A, has been taken away, and the accent on the final syllable has become a grave. What do you mean? The name human signifies that the other animals do not investigate or reason about anything they see, nor do they observe anything closely. But a human being no sooner sees something, that is to say, opope, than he observes it closely and reasons about it. Hence, human beings alone among the animals are correctly named anthropos, the one who observes closely what he has seen. Anathron ha apope. Now, my pronunciation may be very wrong. I am no linguist. But regardless of how I'm pronouncing it, I think we can understand that there is what the relationship that Socrates is speaking of here. Because he's saying that there is something about the structure of the word in our phonetic pronunciation that leads into the nature of the object at hand, And I would say that, again, of nature, we have a set of defining characteristics. And the example that Socrates gives here is the difference in sight between human beings and animals. That man, again, he preserves his ability to investigate and to reason about anything that they see, while animals do not do this. He observes it closely and reasons about it, this opope, and this is included within the context of the word. Hermogenes says, "What comes next? May I tell you what I'd like to have explained?" Of course. It seems to me to be next in order. We speak of the body and soul of the human being. Socrates says, "Certainly." Then let's try to analyze their names as we did previous ones. Are you saying that we should investigate whether soul and body are reasonably named? Hermogenes says, "Yes." Speaking off the top of my head, I think that those who gave soul its name had something like this in mind. They thought that when the soul is present in the body, it causes it to live and gives it the power to breathe the air and be revitalized. An absorption. And that when this revitalization fails, the body dies and is finished. It's for this reason, I think, that they call it soul, or psyche. But hold on a minute, if you don't mind, for I imagine that the followers of Euthyphro would despise this analysis and think it crude. But I think I glimpse one they will find more persuasive. Have a look and see whether it pleases you. Now, if we pause here for a moment, I think it's important to recognize that I'm reading this in English. This was produced in Greek. And so, when we're talking about the etymology of words, that is through the lens of a translation, I think it may be difficult to completely understand exactly how these pieces of the puzzle fit together. But in a general way, despite the translation, we do retain the main point of the argument. Now, I think I'm going to end this episode here, sort of in the middle of a thought, but we will continue on the next part of this episode next time, as Socrates continues to talk about the soul